The story begins a year before the main events, which take place in the Eastern Tower of Seafolk, a freestanding palace in the north. When she opened her eyes, she looked in a small mirror and realized that she was not in her own world, and she had never seen the person in the mirror before. The heroine was featured in one of the novels in which the main plot revolved around the prince and Annie, the prince's girlfriend. The heroine herself became one of Prince Theodore's mentors, Rosalind. Being a mentor to a cursed prince was not an easy task, because most of them did not survive. Prince Theodore was not right from the moment he woke up, which is why he was so named. Usually even novice magicians had no problems with awakening, but not the prince. The imperial family had white, pure mana that had its origins in ancient times. Usually the imperial family awakened at the age of 3, 4, but nothing happened to Theodore, the eldest son. The girl realized that in order to survive, she had to awaken his powers. The only hope was for the prince's girlfriend, Annie. In the novel, the prince's girlfriend managed to awaken his strength through physical contact, which evoked strong emotions. But his happiness did not last long. Theodore killed Annie when his mana went out of control after waking up, destroying his body and mind. As a result, he went insane while hugging his beloved's body. The girl leaned back on her bed. She just wanted to have her own gym, to be a trainer there, but now everything had turned into a dream. Now she was the heroine of a novel she had once read. We first met Rosalind when she appeared with unsteady steps at the door to the Mage Tower. Like most of her colleagues in the profession, she wanted to become a first-class magician. But this world became too cruel for the young wizard, and it quickly shattered all her dreams. She continued to try to survive, and to do so, she needed to learn more about her enemy. The witch decided to start by helping Theodore. He was very angry because of the constant setbacks in his life, starting with the emperor who had turned his back on him when he had not awakened. Moreover, the empress died a couple of years later, and the prince's father soon remarried. The child born in this union was more fortunate and had no problems waking up. Theodore was deprived of all his rights to the throne, and when he turned 10, he was sent into exile to the palace of Seafolk. Rosalind went to the window and opened it, looking out at the world around her. Now she was sure that she had entered the world of the novel. She could feel the piercing cold all over her body. From the open window, a tall tower was perfectly visible, where the light had always been on for 9 years. In one of the rooms, the prince was constantly trying to find a way to awaken. All this time, the young man was looking for an opportunity to end this terrible life. The only goal the prince wanted to achieve was recognition from his father. Burning with the desire to awaken, the prince cruelly accused his teachers of failures and killed them. Then it turned out that his physical condition was completely different. That is why the awakening did not take place. On Theodore's 19th birthday, when he went to the castle for a ceremony, a blonde girl named Annie appeared. Immediately falling in love with her, she reciprocated. Knowing that everything ended with the night she spent, there was no way for Rosalind to do the same, but she had to find a way out as soon as possible, because her life was at stake. The wizard had no more time to think. A servant came into the room and told her that the prince was already expecting her arrival. Anton was the manager of Seafolk Castle. His duties included almost everything related to the castle, as if he were a hostess. Thanks to him, the living conditions were greatly improved. He was a servant who had been looking after the prince since he was a child, even after his exile. When Theodore imprisoned himself in the tower, the steward took on all the responsibility for the castle. Rosalind had no allies who could save her from a terrible fate, so she decided to get Anton on her side at all costs. Then there is a chance to avoid the worst-case scenario. The problem was with the butler himself. He had been serving the prince since he was a little boy, so he had witnessed many crimes that took place in the castle. He was a man of few words and a bit of a secretive person. The wizard did not know what to do. If she tried to win Anton's trust without a plan, he might suspect something. While they were climbing the stairs, the butler stopped abruptly for a moment. The girl noticed that the servant had back problems and came up with a plan. Using her knowledge from her past life, Rosalind stopped the man and quickly found the cause of his pain and gave him a small massage. Anton felt lighter, but the sorceress was not done yet. Asking him to do a few more movements, she finally completed her treatment, and they continued to climb up. The guy no longer felt any pain. He was sincerely grateful to the girl for her help, but they couldn't stay any longer. They were expected. The first impression was good, so they could slowly move on. A shadow covered the prince sitting in front of them. Throughout the novel, his beauty was praised as an attractive man with eyes that conveyed a mystical atmosphere. Filled with an unknown awe that she would finally see Theodore in person, the girl looked up and gazed in horror at the man standing before her. She almost screamed when she looked at my lord. The handsome man who had been so vividly described in the novel looked extremely terrible. Bony shoulders, a hunched back, thin legs, and a face that betrayed illness. The basket of bread on the table was not even touched. In the novel, the prince was also quite weak physically because he was looking for opportunities to wake up. Rosalind realized that this was a complete mess. The girl introduced herself. But my lord immediately realized that she was only a newcomer, so he didn't want to waste any time with her. The shadow of Archibald's assassin stretched out on the floor. Time was running out. Rosalind promised to help, but she needed more time. But Theodore didn't even want to listen. He signaled to the killer, and he slowly started to approach the girl. The sorceress began to look around quickly, looking for a way out. She came across a frame with a photo of the prince's mother, the only person who sincerely loved and protected her son until the end of his life. Glass fell from the broken frame. The last memories of his mother surfaced in the boy's memory, and trembling with anger, he attacked Rosalind, grabbing her by the throat. Theodore stopped abruptly when he felt a strange pulsation in his body, which meant the awakening of mana, albeit a small amount. The girl managed to fulfill her plan and save her life. My lord was extremely exhausted and, unable to withstand the strain, fainted. The sorceress only looked at him sympathetically. Archibald approached them, but she assured him that the prince was fine. After this event, Rosalind officially became Theodore's tutor, but the lessons were postponed due to the latter's health. Anxiety never left her because the prince's physical condition was not good. The tutor frantically began to think about how she could improve my lord's general condition. He would not be able to take any more physical exertion, but a change of scenery could have a positive effect. Outside Rosalind's chambers, Anton stood patiently waiting for her to return, asking for the service she had provided him the previous time. The mentor quickly agreed to give him another massage. The girl was happy to have this opportunity, because the butler was the first to come to her. She hoped that at this rate she would be able to bring up the topic of a change of scenery for the prince. Her happiness did not last long. Anton's buttocks were very hard, which worried her a lot. However, the heroine remembered that her character was a magician. Using mana, she fixed the situation. The man asked what was causing the pain and wanted to find a solution. Rosalind recommended that he take care of his posture and do any physical exercises he could, but he couldn't afford it because he had once severely injured his back. Since then, he has had constant back pain and has been unable to walk or lift anything heavy for long periods of time. Anton begged her to help him get rid of the pain, promising to do anything she asked in return. Rosalind agreed to do various exercises with him that would improve the situation within a month. She managed to fulfill her promise to the butler, and in return, the prince's room was moved to a sunnier side. He seemed to be getting better, so he was going to wake up soon. Looking out the window, hoping that Theodore himself would be able to see this beauty, the girl saw Archibald. She thought it strange that he had left the prince alone, and quickly gathered her things and left the room. Late in the evening, Theodore finally opened his eyes after a long sleep. He remembered the events of the last moment before he lost consciousness, but he knew that this was not enough. Painful memories of the past came flooding back with renewed vigor. I saw the little boy who had been turned away by his own father when he failed to wake up. Theodore had never forgiven him. Ignoring even the feeling of hunger, the prince got out of bed. His eyes were fixed on the stack of papers containing all the information he had collected about the awakening. A moment later, the mentor entered the room. She slowly walked to the window and opened it with a sincere smile directed at him. The sunlight made the girl look even more beautiful. Theodore looked at his mentor's neck, where a bruise was burning brightly. A feeling of shame came almost instantly, and he hurried to apologize for his behavior, but she only smiled warmly. My lord remembered that delicate body and its warmth. His heart thumped loudly in his chest with the incredible realization that he was beginning to like her. The boy's face was flushed, and Rosalind thought he had caught a cold. She was very frightened because the prince's body was not ready to take the new stress, so she hurriedly covered him with a blanket. A small tray covered with a towel stood next to the bed, with a huge selection of different fragrant foods on it. But Theodore turned his head away and said he would let me know when he was ready. The sorceress was not going to let him go, and her first task was to feed him properly. My lord had to give in and quickly began to eat so that he could go to his study. Rosalind was flooded with memories from when she first started her career as a coach. Back then, she barely had enough money to eat and was struggling to find new clients. At that difficult time in her life, her coach came to her rescue. It was he who managed to convince the girl to take her time, and then she would succeed. She approached the prince, holding out a glass of water and saying the same words she had once heard from her coach, hoping that it would help the boy as well. No one else except his mother was so supportive, but she left him, along with her comfort. With no purpose in life, he returned to the imperial garden where they had been walking. No one would have mourned him if he and his mother had been buried underground, because to everyone, he was just a cursed prince. He thought so, until he saw a sunflower on his way that had survived the frost. The sunflower seemed to speak to him, and many questions filled young Theodore's head. He too wanted to bloom like that flower and meet someone who would love him and never leave him. My lord wanted so badly to believe again that his awakening was real. He looked to his mentor for support. For a moment, he thought that the same sunflower was looking at him. Rosalind took Theodore for a walk, but he was not happy and asked almost every minute how much time was left to finish. To make the time pass faster, they decided to make a snowman. The girl looked at my lord and saw that he was already very cold. She went to him and asked him to take off his gloves. She took his hands in hers and tried to warm them a little. She had to experiment with her mana to pull off this trick, but she was happy to help my lord keep warm. Every time the girl touched him, strange feelings overcame him as if under a spell. But he did not want to take his hands away. His mentor's voice jolted him out of his thoughts, and he quickly turned to look away. Rosalind looked at him with concern, thinking he was running a fever. But the prince felt more than fine and continued to make the snowman. After making a big ball, he returned to his tutor. The time for the walk had long since passed, but they did not care. They finished building the snowman, and the witch wanted to drag it closer to the door to avoid getting snowed in, but it was heavy. Theodore called Archie, and he lifted the snowman easily. Seeing the killer lift the snowman with ease, the girl wondered if the prince would ever be able to lift such weights, and she was inclined to believe that this would bring about a quicker awakening. The boy did not understand why he needed to do this, but when he heard the covenant word, he ordered Archie to put the snowman down, and the next moment tried to lift it himself. But it was an unbearable burden for him. Rosalind knew that the prince's physical condition would not allow him to lift the snowman. She ran to stop him, but was not in time. They quickly returned to the castle and began treatment. In the room, the girl began to massage him, but the prince tried to avoid any physical contact with her. She asked him to be patient and let her know if it hurt, but he was not in pain. Every time the girl touched him, his heart beat faster. It was very confusing, so he wanted to stop it and told her to ask Anton to bring some poppy seed milk. Rosalind kept her promise to the butler and did regular exercises with him to help him get rid of the pain. She used exercises that had been popular in her past life. Although the exercises were easy at first glance, they could be a bit difficult if you kept doing them. Anton easily completed the exercises and quickly realized that it was not that simple. The tutor supported him as best she could. She again wanted to ask the butler for a favor regarding the prince's diet and wanted to add more nutrients to it. But the budget allocated by the castle for Sepulka was very limited, and they could not afford to add meat, even once a week. The girl asked to spend less on her food, but Anton immediately refused her because they could not let her starve. Rosalind exhaled a sigh of relief, but she didn't want to argue. She looked out the window and saw a snowman. Looking at the snowman, she saw herself and the prince in it. She felt very lonely and decided to make more snowmen so that the first one would not be as lonely as she was. A strange noise came from behind the tree behind which Archie was always standing, but this time it wasn't him. Looking behind the tree, Rosalind saw a black cat. The cat had a leg that was injured. She used her mana to heal the cat's leg and even let it pet her. The girl had no idea that there was an animal in Suffolk, but she did not know whose it was. The cat went on about his business, and Rosalind went back to modeling. When she had finished the snowman, she put it next to the first one, happy that it would no longer be lonely. Feeling slightly hungry, she returned to the castle where an unexpected surprise awaited her. On the table, in a small plate, was a well-fried bird carcass. Finally, she was able to taste the protein. Archibald walked quietly down the corridor towards the prince's chambers. He blamed himself for his recklessness in falling into the hunter's trap. The boy was a werewolf cat, which was considered evil and cursed in this empire. Theodore found him when he was on the verge of death and took him in, saving his life. A new day had dawned. Rosalind walked to the prince's chambers, humming a song and holding a tray of roast chicken, and was glad to see him getting better. Theodore did not want to open the door and let her in, and even sent her away. She couldn't understand why, but the memory of the prince's invitation to the castle came to mind. My lord opened the door, not knowing how she had heard about it. But it was hard not to know because the invitation had been sent in honor of his half-brother Kyle's birthday. Kyle von Barbarossa became the crown prince after Theodore was expelled from the palace. Every year, he specially invited his brother to his birthday party, where the prince was bullied for a week. Rosalind knew that they needed to go to the main castle, because there was a healer there who might have medicine for Theodore that could help him. She promised to accompany him. She handed the tray to the prince, and after the meal asked him to come to the ballroom to practice his moves. The sorceress tried to help him to get his posture right, but every time she touched him, Theodore's heart beat faster. He abruptly pulled away from the girl, unable to bear this strange feeling any longer. The young man forced his mentor to stay away and just tell him what he had to do. She was very surprised by this behavior, but could not say anything against it. When the training was over, she exhaled. Talking to Anton, the girl asked him to tell her where the healer could be in the main castle, explaining that she would like to find a cure for the prince. The butler drew her a detailed map, but asked her to be very careful. He also asked for her measurements so that he could order a dress for her, but she politely refused. After finishing all her errands, Rosalind went out into the courtyard for a walk. Her eyes were on the cat she had recently met. Archie quickly came to her side, smelling the mint. The long-awaited evening came and the three heroes went to the carriage. The sorceress was overjoyed to finally meet the emperor, who had shamelessly abandoned his son. The carriage was traveling through the forest, and the only sound in it was the sound of hooves. A little more and their long journey would have been over, but the forest was too quiet, which was alarming. A strange sound was heard in the distance, which only Archie heard, but in a moment the arrow flew past the heroes and got stuck in the door. The werewolf managed to cover Rosalind and the prince. The carriage was attacked, but none of the heroes could have thought that someone would want to attack something with the imperial coat of arms. The enemies were goblins, and Archie ran out to protect his lord. Rosalind and Theodore stayed in the carriage waiting for Archibald to return. The prince began to worry that there might be trouble because his mana might be out of control. The mentor tried her best to calm him down so that the irreparable would not happen. A moment later, the carriage began to stagger and finally collapsed. A small group of goblins tried to get inside. One of the monsters managed to find a gap to get inside the carriage, where Rosalind quickly covered the prince. She quickly began to look for a way to repel the attack. The wizard decided to use mana and hit the monsters with it at certain points to deal a devastating blow. She managed to defeat one of the goblins, but another one appeared right behind her. One of the goblins hit the girl hard on the head while she was not looking, and she fell unconscious. Theodore saw this and became very angry and began to release mana to take revenge. A small ray of mana shone in his heart, but his body was not yet ready for such a load, and he fell. Archie arrived just in time to kill the goblin. Holding his mentor in his arms, the prince ordered Archie to quickly find a plant that could stop the bleeding. He nodded silently and ran into the forest. When the cat found the plant, he came back as fast as he could to give it to his lord. Theodore placed a couple of leaves on the girl's wound and prayed that she would open her eyes. A few minutes later, Rosalind regained consciousness and opened her eyes. The prince was overjoyed, but in a moment his strength began to fail, and he fell into her arms, falling into a deep sleep. Due to a recent attack, the heroes had to make an urgent stop. They found a small village and a hotel where they stayed. The local doctor examined the prince and gave him vitamins. Before she lost consciousness, her mentor saw his mana activate, but the mystery was that it made the goblin very angry. It seemed that pure mana was not only a sign of empire. The events developed somewhat differently than in the novel, and the appearance of the goblins was premature, which was surprising, but there was no time to think. 3 or 4 more attempts and Theodore would be able to wake up. After his awakening, everything should have gone back to normal, but it would hardly heal the wounds of the soul. She hoped that Annie could heal them. She herself had only one task, to make my lord wake up in a healthy way, and when that happened, to disappear and return to her world. The prince slowly got out of bed. He had the feeling that he had managed to wake up again, even if only for a short time. And it happened when his mentor was there. His heart ached at the thought of her. He realized more and more that he wanted to see the girl's smile again, to have her smile only at him. He wanted to touch that face and be close to it. At the thought of her, the mana began to awaken again. There was a knock at the door, which woke Rosalind from her sleep. When she opened the door, the prince stood behind them, which surprised her. He wanted to do some training, which impressed her greatly. The exercises were going well, and the mentor realized that Theodore no longer needed her support. But his plan was completely different, because that was exactly what he wanted. He tried to fail some of the exercises so that the girl would correct him more often, but suddenly she decided to end the training because she didn't want to push herself too far. He was upset by this. She gave in to my lord's enthusiasm and decided to continue the lesson a little longer. She wanted to try a new exercise and demonstrated it herself, which actually put Theodore to shame. He tried to do the exercise correctly, and Rosalind smiled at him, and he wanted that smile to be his alone and to stay with him forever. He would do anything for her. 2 days later, the heroes arrived at the castle, but the carriage was abruptly stopped before entering. The atmosphere in the carriage became very tense. The heroes did not understand the reason for the delay. The wizard got out of the carriage to find out the reason for the delay. The guard told her that it was Prince Kyle's order. She was not surprised by this turn of events, for she knew his evil nature. Theodore behaved as calmly as possible. He had accepted the situation long ago. It seemed that this was not the first time this had happened to him. After an inspection, the carriage was finally allowed to pass. The carriage continued on its way, passing the beautiful city. The beauty and sophistication of each house attracted their attention. A large and official meeting on the occasion of Prince Theodore's arrival was not to be expected. No one in the empire was happy to see him. At the entrance to the palace, only one servant was humbly waiting for the guests. Rosalind did not like this situation at all. She considered it unworthy of an imperial palace, but Theodore himself was not surprised. The first thing he wanted to do was to visit his mother. It was only in her chambers that she was able to relax. Even she felt the sense of contempt that was directed at my lord, and sympathy for him overwhelmed her. But she still had to get the medicine. With the start of a new day, she decided to act immediately. Having carefully studied the map of the healer's location, she moved through the corridors of the castle in search of her target. As Rosalind walked through the gardens, She heard a soft chirping sound and quickly found the wounded bird and healed it. An arrow whizzed by her side and hit the ground, narrowly missing her shoulder. She heard footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare turn her head to meet the stranger because she already knew who was behind her. Kyle huffed as he tried to find his prey. The prince eventually asked who was standing in front of him, but quickly realized that it was Theodore's new tutor. He quickly lost interest in her and shot off again in an unknown direction. The bird was only trying to save its life, but the arrow hit it right in the face. Rosalind covered her face in anger. Kyle picked up the prey with contempt and compared it to his brother. The prince started to mock more when he mentioned the test yesterday. The girl finally got fed up and stood up for Theodore, but Kyle was unimpressed. He just laughed harder. Left alone, she could barely contain her anger, but she knew that she could do nothing for now, and that rash actions could only do more harm, and she did not want that. Rosalind had to restrain herself for Theodore's sake, because she knew that his time would come, so she had to do everything she could to awaken him. When she finally reached her destination, she saw the guards. From the novel, she already knew how to distract the guards so that they would let her in. By telling an incredible story, she managed to deceive the guards and get inside. Every shelf in the room was full of different medicines and food supplements, but she needed only one, but she didn't know which one. All the jars looked alike. The sorceress finally found the bottle she needed, but she couldn't reach the shelf. She stood on one step and tried to reach the medicine, but the cabinet fell, almost crushing her. The fall attracted the unwanted attention of the guards, and the girl hurried to leave the premises. There was no time to make a choice, so she took 2 bottles of a food supplement with her. Already in her chambers, she could safely examine the vials of liquid and independently check which one contained the serum of truth. After trying one of the liquids, she was glad she was alone in the room, because it was the truth serum. But suddenly a prince burst into her room. The boy was panting heavily, and grabbing Rosalind begged her to wake him up quickly, because someone had dared to insult his mother's grave by moving it to the servants' cemetery. Theodore was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and she realized that the situation was critical. She knew how she could wake him up, but she couldn't tell him the truth, because according to the novel, Annie was supposed to spend the night with him. The truth serum she had recently taken had not yet ceased to work, and the girl suddenly confessed that she knew how to awaken his mana. The truth came pouring out of her mouth. The sorceress tried to shut her mouth, but she spoke again and told the prince the truth about his awakening. She told him that he would awaken after he spent the night with someone. Theodore couldn't catch his breath and asked the girl to explain what she was trying to say. Her mouth slowly opened to explain in more detail, but the serum had already worn off. Before she could tell the intimate truth, Rosalind asked him to forget everything she had said before. Instead, she gave the prince a bottle of food additive. It was supposed to help him wake up. My lord trusted her and took the bottle. He thought that the liquid might be something forbidden, but he drank everything in the jar without a doubt, and suddenly felt incredibly fresh. The potion worked, and the prince's body underwent a remarkable transformation, giving him a straight posture and muscles. The tutor asked him to lift a table to test his abilities. The prince managed to lift the table and hold it up for a few seconds, which amused Rosalind. He was now about as strong as an 18-year-old boy. This change was a welcome one. Now they could start more challenging exercises and afford longer walks. The plan they had made earlier had begun to work. Late in the evening, when the girl was on her way to her room, she heard a strange noise in the street. One by one, the carriages were arriving at the palace for the daily meeting that lasted for a week. Rosalind and Theodore did not attend these meetings because they were not compulsory, and they did not want the prince to be subjected to pressure from all these people once again. She was sure that by the summer she would be able to awaken my lord, but she was not sure that it would change his mental state. Kyle brought her out of her thoughts. Calling her by name, he invited her to the party, but she delicately declined. But Kyle didn't want to hear any excuses because it wasn't a request, it was an order. The fairy had no choice but to agree. The prince wanted them to go for a boat ride, but the humiliation didn't end there, and he made her steer the oars herself. Kyle started the conversation to find out why the girl was so eager to help Theodore. He wanted to force her to disown her brother, but she persisted and believed in him. This only made him more angry, as he was not used to hearing his orders refused. The atmosphere became more and more tense. Someone suddenly shouted from the shore. After their conversation, Theodore could not understand what his mentor meant when she told him to spend the night with someone. He thought it was a strange ritual of some dark magic. He wondered if he would be able to wake up if Rosalind were there. He closed his eyes for just a moment, imagining her next to him. In a moment, the dream was gone. His chest tightened again, and Theodore stood up, wanting to see his mentor in person. He walked down the corridors in the direction of her chambers, but the girl was nowhere to be found, which made him nervous. He and Archibald quickly began to examine the castle, and the werewolf eventually managed to catch the girl's subtle scent, which led the boys outside to the lake. An unpleasant picture opened before the prince's eyes. Theodore was overcome with anger and resentment, because from the time he was a little boy, Kyle had taken everything from him and destroyed everything he loved. But this time he would not let him take away the one person who had stayed by his side no matter what. The prince quickly took another boat and sailed back to retrieve his. Barely able to contain his anger, he told his brother to let Rosalind go. But Kyle didn't like this disrespect from a man who was a nobody in this castle. But he was not going to back down. The wizard recalled a similar situation in the novel, when Kyle seduced Annie to burn his brother. But Theodore's anger then fell on the girl herself. But now the prince was defending his position. Kyle was not going to let this kind of abuse go by and grabbed Rosalind and threw her into the water. Theodore could no longer stand the abuse and hit his brother for the first time in his life. Before his brother could recover from the first blow, Theodore immediately struck him again. The prince wasted no time in jumping into the water to save the girl. But the odds were not in his favor, as he did not know how to swim, and so he quickly sank to the bottom. Now the situation was that he was the one who needed help. Fortunately, Rosalind held her own in the water. There was no danger to her life. She took in a lungful of air and dived after the prince. She grabbed him and started to climb up. After some changes, Theodore's body was quite heavy, but using his mentor's mana, he managed to swim out of the water and transfer him to the boat. But the water got into his chest and he could hardly breathe. For a moment she froze, knowing that he needed artificial respiration but was afraid to touch him. Gathering all her strength into a fist, she finally started to massage his heart, begging him not to die. After a minute, a little water came out of his chest, so the procedure had to be completed. For a moment, she remembered her past life, where, like the prince, she was despised by her own family. If she had stayed there, she would have lost herself completely. She ran away, not knowing where to go next, but then the path of sport opened up, where lifting heavy dumbbells made her feel braver. Later, she decided to open her own gym. Elle never imagined that she would find herself in an ordinary novel that she used to read for laughs. Theodore was very much like her old self, the one who had trained constantly, sacrificing her health to achieve better results and gain recognition that was not worth it. Rosalind was ready to do anything to ensure his survival. She promised him and herself that she would never give up. The little ray of mana that had been coming out of the prince's chest glowed again. As if on cue, Archibald came to the couple. The girl was glad to see him and asked him to take Theodore to his chambers as soon as possible. I heard the voice of the servants. They were looking for Kyle, who had suddenly disappeared from the ball. The wizard could not wait any longer. She got up and quickly disappeared into the trees so as not to aggravate the situation further. When Kyle returned to the palace, he held the wounded spot on his cheek. His pride had been badly hurt and his anger was coming out in a black fog. He vowed revenge. Finally, Day X came, and today the heroes were to leave the main palace. But the anxiety about yesterday's situation was in the air. Rosalind thought Kyle might be up to no good. There was something wrong with this story. Many things just didn't add up. Although Victor, the kingdom's emperor and Theodore's father, was a criminal, he never openly humiliated him. She understood that he was very upset by the failure of his first son, but it was Victor who had caused the boy's mental trauma. She also didn't understand why the emperor was so obsessed with Awakening. She also did not know why Theodore's mother's grave was moved to the servants' cemetery. It was also strange that he forced the empress to take fertility drugs, even though she had 2 children. Her head hurt badly, so she decided to stop thinking and focus on tonight's ball. She took out the dress Anton had ordered for her. Rosalind put on the dress and looked at herself in the mirror. The dress looked very open and rather plain, but she didn't pay any attention to it because she didn't know the local fashion. Meanwhile, Theodore was also going to the ball. His thoughts were filled with yesterday, but most of all he was worried about the wizard. He personally wanted to make sure that she was okay. But the girl beat him to the door and came to his room. Theodore blushed when he saw her dress, for she was wearing a nightgown. The prince continued to stare at her in silence, which worried her a little, and the wizard thought he was sick. When he came to, he gave her his shirt to cover herself with and sent her back. The mentor quickly returned to her room to change. A few minutes later, they were ready to go to the ball. Guests slowly began to arrive at the ballroom. The emperor's entire family had already gathered opposite them, and Victor himself stood in the center of it. Kyle was there too. He looked at his brother and his mentor and smiled evilly. Theodore had to go back to his family, leaving Rosalind alone. But she didn't waste any time, so she went to try some of the local delicacies. Several noble guests stood nearby and gossiped. As she listened, she heard a story about demons attacking the East. Most people thought these were just fairy tales. The girl was worried because the events in the novel were happening faster now. In the book, the demon attack on Errol was the incident when Theodore met Annie. It happened before his coming-of-age ceremony. Demons attacked a village in the eastern region of the empire. Having lost her parents, Annie was forced to flee to the capital. There she meets a prince who happens to be in the capital for a ceremony. Eventually, the duke of one of the villages dies. This whole story was quite significant in the novel. It was obvious that things were moving faster now, which meant that Annie was already in town. Everything would go wrong if Theodore met her before he woke up. The sorceress was ready to tear her hair out because she didn't know what to do to speed up the prince's awakening. In desperation, she drained the champagne glass in one fell swoop. Fanfare sounded and the eyes of all the guests turned to the emperor and his sons. Theodore's mood was worse than ever and he was impatient to leave the room. One by one, the guests brought gifts to Kyle's feet, congratulating him on his day, but the most important gift was still waiting for him. A gift from the emperor himself, a golden sword, was brought into the hall. Victor took it in his hands and officially appointed Kyle as heir to the empire. The room was overwhelmed with joy, and all the guests, together with the emperor, raised their glasses to congratulate the prince on his appointment. All the guests around them were laughing and chatting. Theodore was the only one who stood to the side, away from the noise. No one paid him any attention. He wanted nothing more than to leave this place with Rosalind as soon as possible. With her, he was much better off anywhere. He understood this clearly now. Finding the girl in the crowd, he moved towards her. But there was one more thing he had to do before he left the ball. Theodore went to his brother and gave him his present. But Kyle wanted something else from him. The heir wanted Rosalind to be put at his disposal. Everyone's eyes suddenly turned to the girl, who was really scared this time. Theodore wanted to object, but the emperor sided with his younger son, because the older one did not need a mentor since he had not been able to awaken. For the first time in his life, the young man refused his father. Victor was not used to hearing no, especially from his unawakened son. For his disobedience, Theodore received a severe slap on the wrist, and the emperor ordered the girl to be brought to him. With her head bowed, she stood waiting for the verdict. The situation was getting out of hand, and she had to think of something immediately because Kyle could kill her at any moment. Determined to rectify the situation, she looked at the prince. Tears of helplessness were streaming down his face. He seemed to have accepted his defeat and his arms had already given up. It was heartbreaking. She wanted to give him hope and support at all costs. With a warm smile, Rosalind told the prince not to worry, that she would be fine. These words struck him like a thunderbolt. He couldn't let himself lose the only thing he had again. He had never been so eager to wake up to become a better man and be able to protect the one he loved. Theodore hugged the girl and did not let her go. He only wanted to protect her, but he was powerless to do so. At that very moment, a strong stream of snow-white mana swirled around him. Like all the other guests at the party, Victor could not understand what was happening. He thought that his son's mania was out of control and ordered his servants to take him out of the room, but no one could come near him. The prince asked Rosalind to look up at him and asked her again if she believed in his awakening. With all the sincerity in her heart, she confirmed that she did. Everything was quiet around them. It seemed as if they were the only ones there. Theodore gave in to the moment and kissed Rosalind tenderly with his emotions. The power of his mana became even stronger. The radiance was so strong that it blinded everyone around. The prince was finally able to achieve the power he had always wanted, but it was no ordinary awakening. Even in the novel, little was described about super awakenings. He was given an unprecedented power that only the ancient ancestors of the imperial family had used to fight off the demons and establish the empire. The emperor looked at his eldest son and realized that he had finally awakened. He called him by name, but the prince returned his previous words. Theodore took away Kyle's sword, a gift from their father because from that moment on he was the crown prince. No one could object. From that moment on, his brother had no right to take Rosalind away. When he returned to his father, he asked for his mother's grave to be moved to an appropriate place. There was no point in staying in the hall any longer. Taking the sorceress with them, they left the hall. Longing and sadness covered the street like a sudden cold. The boy's tears came out again, washing his mother's coffin. How he wished that the closest person to him could also witness his awakening. Of course, his mother could not be replaced, but he finally had a person in his life who believed in him as much as he did, and was now there to comfort him as much as she could. He was incredibly grateful to her for everything. She fulfilled her promise. Theodore had finally awakened and would now stay in Zyfolk, and her work was complete. The bags were packed and ready to go. After waking up, His Majesty had no more time. He had a lot to do, so the training had to be postponed indefinitely, which was naturally frustrating. But in the end, she managed to survive, just as she had wished. She should have been happy with this ending and should have returned to the tower by now, but she didn't want to leave Zyfolk. The girl felt a little sad, but suddenly she remembered the cat that lived in the garden. When she returned, she decided to take the animal in, but first she had to write a letter of resignation. Memories of all her past days in this world came flooding back. It seemed as if it was all a dream and she was about to wake up again as a gym trainer, returning to an empty apartment every night. But the feeling of the kiss at the ball was real, so it was definitely not a dream. My resignation letter was already on the table, filled out, and I just had to take it to the office. Theodore sat in his chambers preparing for another hard day. The butler knocked on his door and dictated the day's schedule, which did not include a single free minute. The negotiating table was full of important people, but there was one whom Theodore had never seen before. On the agenda was a solution to the problem of refugees fleeing the demon attack. Count Sahish Hilda took the floor. He did not believe in demons, considering them to be a mere invention to cover up an attack by a gang of bandits. Delsanmin Kailana supported the count. She too thought it was all just a misunderstanding. She had heard that there were unfounded rumors in the eastern region, so it would be wise to ignore them. But all this was not just rumors. A couple of days before Kyle's birthday, Theodore was attacked. Everyone wondered why the prince hadn't reported it, but he knew he wouldn't have been believed. A gloomy atmosphere suddenly prevailed in the room, and a blond young man stepped in to break it. It didn't matter who the attackers were, but reinforcements were really needed in the east. The emperor agreed and ordered the troops to be sent. Everyone was interested in who the stranger was. Sir Preston was unable to attend the meeting due to a sudden deterioration in his health, so he sent his son on his behalf. Theodore could not help but know the one nobleman who had never despised him. When he had finished all his work and returned to his room, he flopped down on the bed, overwhelmed by the fatigue of the long day. It was quite late in the day, so knocking on the door at this hour was very strange. Rosalind stood outside the door and asked to see her, as she had something to tell her. Sitting at the table, she handed over a small envelope containing her resignation. The realization that her help was no longer needed was a mistake, even for her. The prince didn't even want to hear about her leaving, especially without him. He did not want to let her go. The sorceress was surprised by this behavior, but did not know the reason. After a moment, she thought that the prince probably wanted her to stay with him as his personal trainer. His Majesty did not understand what the training had to do with anything, but he had to confirm it by hiding the truth deep inside himself. The former mentor agreed, knowing that this was the best option. The prince's happiness jumped out, which was very encouraging. The girl wanted to return to her old chambers but was stopped by the promise of another room. Rosalind hadn't forgotten about the cat that lived in their old castle, so she asked for permission to take it in. But she was quickly informed that the cat already had an owner. Theodore said that he was the owner, and had already asked Anton to bring the animal to the palace, so that the girl could spend time with him at any time. She ran off to prepare gifts for the animal. 2 days later, most of the servants who worked in the old castle had already arrived at the palace. Anton was among them. The preparation of Rosalind's new room was complete. Theodore opened the door and immediately felt the freshness and cleanliness. It was his mother's room. But that was not all. In the other part of the room was a wardrobe, where new exquisite dresses had been brought in, all made to order. He hoped that the girl would like all these gifts. Meanwhile, the sorceress was doing her training, unaware of the surprise that was already waiting for her. While jogging, she meets the same cat and drags him along. On her way to the castle, she heard a strange clatter and stopped for a moment to look at the knight's training room. As a trainer, she was fascinated by the sight. One of the knights notices the girl and calls for Commander Aiden to speak to her. The name was very familiar to her. A moment later, a tall man was walking towards her. Rosalind stood there in disbelief at her good fortune, for she had met a very prominent person who was mentioned several times in the novel. At the young man's request, she hurried to leave the site. Aiden Haley was an outstanding knight and the youngest commander in the history of the Empire. He was the first to go on a mission to exterminate demons. He disappeared from the pages of the novel for a long time, but when he returned, he was already facing madness, which, according to the story, was rewarded by demons. After that, he became a knight who killed both monsters and people. The mentor began to look for a way out so that she could save Aiden from his fate and try to win him over to her side. Such a knight would be a great protector for Theodore. Hugging the cat, the girl smelt an unpleasant odor and hurried to bathe the animal. The prince came into the bathroom to tell her that the new rooms were ready. The wizard quickly gathered her things, which fit into her handbag. She was glad to see Anton again and noticed that he looked much better since their last meeting. When the other servants also noticed such a good change in him, they wanted to get advice from her about training. It seemed that she had found her purpose. Theodore didn't like this very much because Rosalind was his trainer too. She offered to join a group class but was rejected. In the end, she decided to offer personal training. Starting today, Anton was also her servant, which made her very happy. He allowed the girl to address him by his first name because he was no longer a butler in the palace. Her relationship with Tony was getting better and better. At times, they didn't even notice the prince's presence, which hurt him and made him jealous. My lord was eager to show her the room. He did not reveal the truth of whose room it was, but he hoped that Rosalind would like it. When she saw the room, she wanted to give up such luxury. However, everyone knew that she really deserved this treatment. Not one to take no for an answer, the prince insisted that his proposal be accepted, and the girl no longer dared to protest. She was taken to another room where there was a wardrobe. The prince wanted her to try on one of the dresses. She was overwhelmed by the number of luxurious things. Theodore wanted to see how one of the dresses would look on her, so he asked her to try it on. When Rosalind was done changing, she came out to show him the dress. In the spur of the moment, His Majesty gave the girl permission to call him by his shortened name. He drew her to him and they merged in an embrace. The next day, the servants began to gather for training with Rosalind, and more people came forward. The rumors that Anton had spread quickly spread through the castle. About 30 people came to the group training, which was quite a lot. We didn't want to delay anyone, so we had to start training, but there was not enough space on the pitch for that many people. The situation was getting out of hand, as people were physically running out of space to do the exercises. The girl wanted to move her group to the training field, but without Anthony's permission, it was impossible. She thought about it and started to look for a solution quickly and knew what might work. Usually at this hour, Sir Anthony was in his office. She gathered her strength and set off to find him. The young man was sitting at his desk, shoveling through a pile of documents. His head was already pounding from the strain, but there was nothing to do, because he had to replace his sick father. I came across a scroll sent by one of those who went to investigate the situation with the demons in the east. According to the information, no attack had happened yet. Everything seemed to be just a rumor. The situation was very strange because the prince claimed that he had been attacked by goblins, and Anthony had no reason not to believe him. The arrival of His Majesty's coach distracted him from his worrying thoughts. Entering the office, the girl introduced herself and, without wasting the knight's time, immediately asked for a favor and explained the situation in detail. It was a very strange request for him. Anthony wanted to refuse because the site was a military facility. Knowing that the commander was a man of great faith, Rosalind resorted to a ruse, but she was quickly discovered. However, Anthony still wanted to know if she was a true believer. She could not find an answer for a long time, and only said that she took any obstacles sent to her for granted. Recalling himself in her words, the young man hastened to apologize for doubting her faith, so he eventually allowed her to use the training ground for her own purposes 3 times a week, and exceeded her expectations. The knight looked at the coach, who was not happy, and asked if she could stay a little longer and answer a few questions. During a personal training session, the prince's eyes did not escape the fact that his mentor was in a good mood, and he was in a hurry to find out why. It was simple, because she now had a training ground at her disposal. He was surprised that Aiden, who was so straightforward, could be persuaded, although Theodore himself admired him because he was able to persuade the nobility in a logical way, which he could not. Rosalind wanted Theo to get to know the commander. They were about the same age, so they could have even become friends, but the prince was rather jealous of him, but he couldn't admit it. The prince did not disclose the whole reason for his unwillingness to meet the knight in person, and the girl only sighed sadly, for she had already made some plans that were now not destined to come true. Theodore suddenly coughed heavily. This was very alarming. The fact that none of them knew the cause of the spasms added fuel to the fire, but my lord did not want to dwell on it. When she had finished, Rosalind looked at him anxiously. The sorceress accidentally came across Anton, who was helping the Empress with preparations for the tea party. This seemed strange, because the event was being held more and more often. For the Empress, this was no ordinary reception. She used them to strengthen relationships between families for the sake of support. After Theodore's awakening, there were more of them. Something was wrong with this. The Crown Prince still didn't have much free time. This time he was at school and was studying the history of his family with his teacher. A cough made him cough again. The whole story about ordinary awakening and its necessity in the imperial family was not very interesting. Most of all, he wanted to know about super awakening, but there were few records about it. The only thing that was known was that super awakening was capable of driving away evil. This was the reason why the goblin who once attacked the prince's carriage tried to escape. The following week, Theodore was also to begin martial arts training. As a crown prince, he had to know at least the basics of ceremonial swordplay. Meanwhile, Rosalind was trying to find out the reasons for all the strange events in the castle. As she walked through the garden, the servants came across her and whispered quietly about something. She hid to listen in. One of the maids quickly ran past the rooms and came to the Empress's chamber. She held a vial of strange liquid in her hands, and on the orders of her mistress, handed it to the guards. The training was finally over, and Theodore staggered up to his chambers to get some rest. His eyes fell on the window where he could see his tutor training with Aiden. He was not happy with this scenario, so he quickly went outside to find out what it all meant. The girl reassured him that it was just a training exercise. His Majesty was about to say something else, but an ominous cough again silenced him. This time, however, it was worse, and blood flowed down the boy's arms in thin streams. A local doctor came to check on my lord, but he found nothing wrong. He was medically fine. Rosalind and Anton looked at each other with concern. She couldn't understand why one of the reasons for the mana explosion had suddenly surfaced, because all her training had been to prevent it. There were thoughts about His Majesty's deteriorating health. One was worse than the other, but allergies were rejected at once, because no other servants showed such symptoms. It seemed that the poisoning was deliberate. Theodore finally opened his eyes, and the girl decided to ask him if he had eaten anything other than his usual diet. But apart from the lavender tea he had been drinking in class, it was the same as usual. When she heard about lavender tea, she was very wary. The color of the tea was purple, so no one would notice if some strange liquid was added. The prince described the servant who brought the tea. Anton recognized one of the Empress's maids from the description given to him. It immediately occurred to him that Her Majesty might have been involved in the poisoning of the prince, but there was no evidence at the time. Rosalind wanted to do her own investigation, but Tony didn't like the idea. Even if she talked to the maid, Dana would never tell the truth. Moreover, if the Empress found out that they were digging under her, she would be executed for disrespecting the imperial family. The sorceress tried to calm everyone down. She had a plan to bring the maid to light and confess everything. A bottle of truth potion was hidden on one of the shelves. She added a couple of drops to the tea she was going to give Dana. A minute later, there was a knock at the door and a maid came in. The girl wondered why she was called. She took a couple of sips of tea which contained a truth potion. The mentor began a seemingly ordinary conversation about Dana's work at the Empress's court. The potion began to work, and with the right questions, the maid began to tell the whole truth. She tried to stop the ominous flow of words but could not. From her words, Rosalind understood that the Empress was still to blame, but that one of the guests who had come to the tea party had told her about the poison. After this incident, the prince no longer suffered from coughing fits. Today he had his first martial arts class, taught by Aiden Haley. It seemed as if he was preparing for a meeting with the enemy. The opponents drew their weapons and the lesson began. After the cause of the terrible pain and cough was identified, Theodore felt better and better. During one of his sessions, his trainer noticed this and complimented him on it. But the anxiety did not want to leave her, because the poisoning was deliberate, and therefore there was still a threat to her life. The attacker had not yet been caught, and there was no evidence. She had to get to one of the Empress's tea parties. Her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by an unusual request from His Majesty. The girl was quite surprised by this because in her opinion he looked great, but he had an opponent he wanted to beat, so he needed to train. He was in no hurry to reveal his identity. Since Theo wanted to increase the load on his upper body, Rosalind showed him some exercises, one of which was push-ups. Aiden picked it up immediately and did 100 on his first try. This motivation worked well, but he had to cancel the next day because his whole body was in pain. It would have been nice to add at least a little yoga to his training. She went out into the yard to look for a good place to practice yoga. The cat followed Rosalind, but she left him by the tree and went to look around. At the training ground, she meets Aiden. She teaches the knights and is amazed to see how they can easily cope with even the most difficult exercises. The lesson was over, and the commander thanked him for his time. He felt a strange pounding in his heart as Rosalind slowly approached him. He invited her to have tea with him one day, and she agreed. For the day, the work was done, so she headed for the castle to do other things. On the way, she wanted to take her cat with her, but it wasn't in the place where she had left it. The magician tried her best to find the animal, but she could not find it anywhere. Her anxiety began to rise, almost reaching its peak. Suddenly, she heard a soft mewling among the trees. She moved towards the sound of the blade of grass. A strange smell enveloped her. When she found the cat, she was overcome with fear. The cat was lying in a pool of blood, but it was still alive. The animal was badly injured. Rosalind arrived just in time before the worst happened and quickly healed the poor man. The strange scent grew stronger, and a terrible thought struck like a thunderbolt. There was a demon here. The monster grabbed her and squeezed her hard. She tried to scream, but there was not enough air. She needed to somehow escape from the beast's embrace, and quickly began to look for a way out. The demon was not going to let her go. The girl examined the animal more closely, but could not understand why a gremlin, a high-level demon, had suddenly appeared in the palace. The demon screamed loudly and pulled the prisoner towards him. He bit her neck hard and she screamed in pain and fear, begging for help. At the strange noises and shouts, the knights with Aiden at their head came running. The men paused for a moment when they saw the unknown creature in front of them, for it was the first time they had seen it. The commander spoke first. He shouted at the trainer to duck and quickly slashed at the gremlin with his sword, but it only enraged him, causing almost no damage. The demon's skin was very thick, but the knight did not give up and struck again. This time the wound was more serious than the previous one, although the demon managed to partially block the blow. The gremlin was ready to strike back, but it was all in vain. The boy perfectly repelled all the attacks and the monster had no choice but to accept defeat and retreat. The knight lowered his weapon. The battle was over. He quickly approached Rosalind, who was recovering from the bite, but she was most worried about the animal. This surprised everyone around us, because cats brought only bad luck, so such anxiety about the animal was very strange. Everyone was silent, but no one moved. When she saw that none of the knights were going to come, She decided to approach the animal to make sure it was okay. Aiden just watched, not understanding this desire to save the cursed animal. The commander was ashamed of his behavior and the fact that he did not immediately understand the girl's feelings. He wanted to correct his mistake and offered to take the animal to the medical center on the training field. Rosalind's tears welled up with joy. She was grateful for this kindness. She looked reproachfully at the other knights and asked them to tell the prince about his pet. The friends rushed to the medical center. Aiden gave the cat first aid and bandaged all its wounds. The animal was fine and was expected to recover soon. The girl thanked him for his help, but suddenly she felt sick. She started to feel dizzy and almost fainted. The commander suspected something was wrong. It was not an ordinary wound. The monster had managed to poison her, and the poison had to be removed from her body urgently, otherwise it could have killed her. The young man approached her and told her that the poison needed to be removed from her body, but she did not understand how to do it. He asked her to forgive him for what he was about to do and bent down. The boy began to suck the poison out of the wound. She staggered back for a moment from the surprise and sharp pain. He asked her to be patient for a while, which she agreed to, but she was ashamed of the situation. The messengers eventually reached the prince's chambers and delivered the bad news. Theodore was overwhelmed with strong feelings and fear for his loved ones who might be in trouble. He couldn't imagine anyone daring to attack the palace. He jumped out of his chair and wondered who it was. A servant reported the demon's attack. The prince ran to find Rosalind. But when he came to the medical center, he witnessed a not very pleasant situation. He was too shocked to say a word. Theodore did not understand what was happening. All he could see was Rosalind. She was barely standing and the commander was bending over her. He quickly approached the boy and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. The wizard hurried to stop him before a fight broke out. Aiden was only trying to help her and meant no harm. The prince quickly turned to her. After the girl's words, he forced himself to calm down and wanted to hear from his subordinates what had really happened. She told him that a demon had suddenly appeared near the training field. The cat was already badly injured. The next victim was supposed to be her mentor, but Sir Aiden came to the rescue in time. If not for him, both she and the cat would have died. Theodore came over and hugged her. Now she was okay, and that was the most important thing. The warmth of his embrace made her feel better. The poison was eventually removed from her body, but she needed to be put on ointment to help the wound heal faster. His Majesty did not want the commander to touch her again, so he decided to heal the wound himself. One question remained unresolved, however, as no one knew how the demon had managed to enter the palace. Aiden decided to report the situation to the emperor. However, there were great doubts about this, because there was a high probability that neither the emperor nor the rest of the nobility would believe it. The prince and his tutor left the room, leaving Aiden alone. When they got to the courtyard, they changed direction, and Theo led her to the training ground. He only wanted to get stronger so that he could swing his sword without hurting himself. The coach just looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand why he was so passionate about getting better. There was no reason to push himself so hard, so she thought there was another reason. She agreed to do the training, but warned him that the exercises would be much harder than before. Theodore nodded in acceptance. His determination was the envy of anyone. The next day, Rosalind was walking in the garden and accidentally came across an interesting situation. A carriage arrived at the palace with a whole bunch of different gifts for the Empress. She kept thinking about the tea parties that the Empress regularly held in her chambers. Suddenly, a violent quarrel caught her attention. She looked closely and saw one of the servants being shouted at. The maid was slapped with a hard slap and accused of being reckless. The sorceress looked at the servant for a while, trying to remember who she might have looked like. The face was very familiar. Finally, she remembered. Curiosity got the better of her, and as she passed the other maids, she overheard them talking. The girls were not happy that the newcomer was being mocked in such a way, but the Empress herself was indifferent. Servants usually did not survive more than a month in the palace because of such terrible treatment. But the new girl's situation was completely different, because she was a refugee from the East and had nowhere else to go. It was definitely Annie, the main character of the novel, standing in front of her. Rosalind wondered if she should introduce her to the prince, but decided not to interfere. Suddenly, unpleasant feelings came over her. The girl noticed that all the maids from the Empress's court had gone to her chambers. She was very curious to know why, so she went up to one of them to ask. All maids were required to attend the tea party to serve the Empress and the other guests. Annie was no exception, but she was constantly bullied. Sharp and hurtful words flew in her direction from each of the maids, but one of them decided to mock her the most by giving Annie a basket of flowers with maggots in them. She was supposed to take the flowers to the Empress's chambers, but was stopped before entering to inspect the basket. Unaware, Annie handed the basket over, but it was almost thrown in her face. The abuse did not stop for a moment. The other maids were reluctant to accept a refugee from the East into their ranks, and she just silently accepted all the moments of such a life. Rosalind came to the rescue of poor and frightened Annie. Holding the cat in her arms, she threatened the servants and they slowly retreated, but one of the servants wanted to put her in her place. She didn't even flinch, but instead grabbed the upstart's arm and squeezed his arm hard in the elbow area. The guy's arm went numb from the sharp pain and he backed away. The wizard came to Annie to calm her down. By removing the larvae and smiling at her, she wanted her to be able to fight back when she was insulted. Rosalind wanted to go about her business, but Annie, with tears in her eyes, asked her in a quiet voice to stay a moment longer. When she recovered from her hysteria, she ran up to her protector and hugged her tightly. She was still shaking like a little animal in her mentor's arms. The girl had only one request. After arriving at the palace, she was very lonely and had nowhere to seek protection, so she tearfully asked Rosalind to be her sister. She thought about it, but agreed. Annie was happy, because she finally had someone to tell all her problems and worries to after a long time in this palace. She introduced herself. The maid didn't want to let her new friend go, so she offered to help if she needed it. The sorceress was about to refuse but suddenly remembered something and accepted the offer. Rosalind gave the girl one important task, and she returned the next day to tell her what she had learned. She was already waiting in the room with treats and tea. Annie had to find out what the Empress and her guests were talking about at the reception, but she did not hear anything suspicious. She only noticed that the Empress had taken a greater interest in gardening. It seemed very strange to her mentor, because she had never seen the Empress walk in the garden, let alone take care of the plants. Nevertheless, word got around that she was looking for a new weed killer, but that remedy didn't work, so she came up with another method called the duck remedy. Birds played an important role in this regard. They were set free in the garden to eat bad plants and harmful insects. Recently, one such bird was released, but it escaped. Rosalind wondered who had suggested that the Empress use this idea, but Annie did not know who the person was. All she knew was that it was some kind of gardening expert. According to Annie's description, the foreign stranger was definitely a devil, a powerful demon of a high level. But they had no idea how he got here, because they had been banished by the first emperor for 500 years. All this went beyond the scope of the story from the novel. There was no question of the Empress joining forces with the devil. Moreover, the devil promised to get rid of the weeds himself next time. This news almost made the mentor faint. Things were getting worse because even a whole garrison of knights could not cope with one demon. Annie looked at her in disbelief. Rosalind thought about it and remembered another detail from the novel that she would like to use. Each devil had a tattoo that indicated their powers. She turned to the maid again. The trainer wanted to ask Annie for a favor again, but this time it was quite a difficult one. The girl needed to check the tattoo on the devil's chest, but she didn't know how to do it. The wizard thought she was asking too much of her friend, so she wanted to dissuade her, but seeing her savior's upset look, Annie was ready to fulfill the request at any cost. A few days later, Annie returned to report on the situation. She managed to sneak a peek at the devil's tattoo. It was a rose. The sorceress paused for a moment, recalling the meaning of this tattoo. The rose was a symbol of the incubus. These creatures could penetrate dreams and even kill a person in this way. After thanking the maid for her work, she did not forget to ask her if she had any wishes. The girl thought about it and then asked to work for her so that she could work in the palace. This situation could have had a positive impact on the whole story, as Annie could have continued to provide the necessary information. Not only that, but she could have met the prince because they were supposed to be together. Rosalind made her decision and went to the prince the next day to discuss the matter. She asked him to hire maids from outside the castle, which surprised him. At the request of his mentor, he eventually agreed to accept Annie as one of his servants. But that was not all, and she confessed that the Empress was behind all the attacks, but there was no exact proof yet. She needed time to gather evidence, so she had to ask Archibald to look after Theodore while he slept for a period of time. The boy did not like this idea very much, because he was more worried about her than himself, although the girl tried to convince him otherwise because she was not a threat to the Empress. The prince did not back down and forced her to spend the night together to make sure that nothing would happen to her. She was very embarrassed by this situation, but she could not refuse. Theodore was about to leave the room and go on guard, but Rosalind stopped him. She was still uncomfortable about it, but she couldn't let him stay on guard all night either. She made room for him and pulled him in and made him lie down next to her. She couldn't sleep, and her mind was full of thoughts. After a moment, Theodore asked her to hug him. The sorceress stared at him for a moment, her eyes wide. Seeing this awkward delay, he explained that he wanted to ask her permission to hug her because he thought she was scared. She agreed. 2 days later, Rosalind prepared more carefully for a possible attack, because according to the novel, something was bound to happen on the third day. She had several bottles of stimulants in front of her. Having fallen asleep in the prince's arms, she found herself in an unknown place. It seemed that the incubus's magic had reached her. She looked around and saw her family from her past life. Her only wish was to wake up. The stimulants did not work, and the girl did not know how the enemies found out about it. The devil came into their room holding a strange bottle. The incubus brought with him a strange creature that put everyone on the floor to sleep. The demon came with only one goal, to kill the prince. But before that, he wanted to give him a sweet dream. Enveloped in the flowers and warm breeze, Theodore realized that they had been attacked after all. So Rosalind could be in danger too. He tried his best to find her, but no one answered. As he wandered through the field, he saw a barely visible figure in the distance. He began to approach quickly, thinking it was her, but it was his mother. He was overcome with happiness, and quickly threw himself into her arms, not believing his eyes. Words flowed from his mouth in a steady stream. He had so much to tell and show her. He suddenly heard a familiar voice behind him. He turned his head to meet it and saw Rosalind slowly approaching him. The girl was dressed just like his mother, but he didn't want to pay attention to it. He didn't care. He was overwhelmed with happiness. Theo took her hand and brought her to his mother to introduce her. A strong earthquake interrupted this happy moment, and a huge shadow covered them. The monster's ominous roar resounded over the entire field, but no one moved. The prince stopped for just one moment and looked at the creature in disbelief. He called for the guards, but no one came. Taking his mother and the sorceress by the hand, they began to run away. The woman caught on her own dress and fell, which the demon quickly took advantage of and grabbed her. Theodore turned around to save her, but heard a strange noise and stopped. The hand holding the girl suddenly became empty. The monster grabbed her as well, and he was left alone to watch as the people close to him were simultaneously in danger. She was screaming for help. Theodore just stood there watching in mute shock. The dream, which had been so beautiful a few minutes ago, turned into a nightmare in an instant.